All right, so today we're going to look at something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
A very tactile, hands-on approach to a problem that you, our listener, might be struggling with in your own projects and work.
Okay.
And even if you're not a screenwriter,
Gotcha.
we're going to be looking at what's called the board,
Right.
a physical space where a story or really any kind of complex plan or project starts to take shape
Yeah.
using index cards and a good old-fashioned board.
That's right. Forget that digital blank page. We're talking about getting physical with your ideas.
Oh, yeah.
Index cards, pens,
Yeah.
maybe push pins if you're into that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All coming together on a real board in the real world.
Yeah.
And it can be surprisingly powerful.
I can imagine you, the listener, might be thinking, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Isn't this a bit old school?
Sure.
And doesn't this sound like a fantastic recipe for procrastination?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that trip to the stationery store,
Yeah.
for the perfect board and the perfect shade of sticky notes.
Oh, yeah. That's prime procrastination time.
Prime dawdling territory.
Yeah. You're not wrong. There is a time investment for sure.
Yeah.
And you got to gather your supplies, set things up. But what's really interesting here, and what you might find applies to your own planning processes,
Yeah.
is that all this time wasting actually offers a pretty significant benefit.
Okay.
When you physically engage with your ideas and start arranging and rearranging them, the core concepts really start to seep into your subconscious
Yeah.
in a way that just staring at a screen sometimes doesn't allow.
It's like the problem you're trying to solve or the story you're trying to tell is marinating
Yeah.
while you're physically messing around with these representations of it.
That's a great way to put it.
So how does this board thing actually work?
Okay.
What's the typical layout and how could our listeners adapt this for their own needs?
The basic setup is really straightforward.
Okay.
You divide your board into 4 horizontal rows.
Okay.
Think of it like a timeline. If we're talking about a screenplay, the first row represents Act 1,
Okay.
the first 25 pages where the world and the characters are introduced.
Okay, so Act 1, the foundation.
Exactly.
What about the other rows on the board?
Okay, so row 2 covers the first half of Act 2,
Okay.
roughly pages 25 to 55, which leads us to the midpoint of the story.
Right.
Row 3 takes us from that midpoint 55 to 85
Okay.
and ends with the break into Act 3.
Okay.
And finally, row 4 is Act 3, from about page 85 to the end, around page 110.
So these rows are basically the major phases or movements of the project,
Exactly.
whether it's a movie or something else entirely.
Uh-huh.
And you would use something as simple as masking tape or a marker to create these divisions.
Totally masking tape marker. Keep it simple.
Keep it functional.
Yeah, don't get bogged down with the aesthetics right now.
Yeah.
The key is just to have those clear visual boundaries.
Yeah.
But within this structure, the ends of each row become really significant. As you might expect, the end of Act 1 is where you find the break into 2, that moment where the protagonist fully commits to their central objective.
Yeah.
Likewise, the end of Act 2, right before the final act, is the break into 3.
Right.
And, of course, the midpoint is right there in the middle of row 2.
Yeah.
And these are like the major junctures that drive the narrative or the project timeline forward.
Okay, so we've got the board divided into 4 sections.
Right.
And now it's time for the index cards to come into play.
Yep.
So what is the very first card that you would place on this blank canvas?
Oh, the very first card is easy.
Yeah.
It's simply the title of your movie or the core objective of the project.
Right.
You place it at the top, take a step back, and just observe all the empty space below you.
It's exciting, but it's also a little bit daunting.
For sure, it can be a little daunting, but think about the potential.
Oh, yeah.
It's all there in front of you.
Yeah.
And the goal, at least for a screenplay, is to have around 40 of these index cards on the board, each representing a scene or a significant step in your plan.
40 cards for a whole movie? That doesn't sound too bad.
Yeah, it's doable.
What kind of information do you actually write on each of these scene cards?
At this point, just the bare minimum.
Okay.
For a screenplay, is it an interior location or an exterior location?
Right.
What time of day is it, day or night?
Gotcha.
And then a simple declarative sentence that captures the core action of the scene.
So something like Mary tells Joe she wants a divorce?
Exact, just the fundamental event that occurs in that moment.
Okay, so when you're first starting out, do you try and put these in chronological order right away?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It's often better to start with what I call your burning ideas.
Okay.
Those key moments or milestones that you're most excited about.
Yeah.
The things that spark the whole project in the first place.
Yeah. Get those down.
You get those down on the cards.
Yeah.
Put them on the board roughly where you think they belong.
Okay.
But don't worry about perfect placement at this point.
Yeah.
You might move these cards around later or even get rid of them entirely.
It's almost like brainstorming before you actually solidify the order of operations.
It is brainstorming.
So I can imagine the listener looking at their board now with these initial ideas and seeing a lot of empty space.
Right.
Is that a normal part of the process?
Absolutely.
Is that a good thing?
It's a very good thing.
Okay.
Because that visual representation of all the work ahead of you is really valuable.
Okay.
It's a good reality check.
Yeah.
To see how much work still needs to be done beyond those initial bursts of inspiration.
Yeah.
And it gives you a tangible sense of the scope of what you're undertaking.
It can be a motivator?
It can be, or it can be terrifying.
Yeah. So you've got a few key moments mapped out.
Right.
How do you start to fill in the gaps?
So after you get those initial ideas on the board, the next crucial step is to identify and place those major structural points we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Definitely the midpoint, that moment of significant shift, a false victory or a major setback.
Yeah.
That typically occurs around page 55 in a screenplay.
Okay.
Then you want to solidify the break into Act 2 and the break into Act 3.
Right.
And those act as the cornerstones of your narrative or your project timeline.
The midpoint sounds particularly critical.
It is.
You described it as a false victory or defeat?
Yes.
Can you explain why that specific kind of turning point is so effective?
Well, what's interesting about the midpoint is that it raises the stakes.
Okay.
It often misdirects the protagonist and the audience.
Okay.
It can create this sense that the goal has been achieved,
Yeah.
only for things to dramatically shift.
Oh, wow.
Or it can be a devastating blow that forces a complete change in strategy.
Right, like a reevaluation.
Exactly.
And the outline also mentioned this thing called all is lost.
Right.
Where does that typically fit into the structure?
So all is lost is often seen as the emotional counterpoint to the midpoint.
Okay.
It usually follows the midpoint, and it represents the lowest point for the protagonist.
Yeah.
So any sense of hope or advancement they experienced at the midpoint is now gone.
Yeah.
It's a moment of despair that sets the stage for the final uphill battle of Act 3.
So these structural points are starting to create a clearer framework.
Right.
But as you begin to add the scenes that occur between these major turns, the outline mentioned this challenge of overloaded acts with too much backstory crammed in.
Oh, this is such a common pitfall.
Oh, especially in the early part of the story.
Especially in Act 1.
Yeah.
You have all this information about your character's history.
Yeah, you want to get it all out.
You got to get it all out on the page. And the temptation is to put each piece of background information on its own card.
Right.
But you got to remember, those individual pieces of backstory aren't actually scenes.
They're just exposition.
Exactly. They're exposition.
Yeah.
They're not unfolding in the present moment of the story.
So instead of having multiple cards detailing a character's past trauma, those details should be woven into the active scenes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Integrate those background elements into the dramatic scenes of your movie.
Yeah.
For instance, a Meet the Hero scene could reveal aspects of their past through their actions, their dialogue, how they interact with their environment.
Show, don't tell.
Exactly. Show, don't tell.
It makes a lot of sense.
Right.
It keeps the beginning from becoming a static information dump.
Keeps the focus on what's happening right now
Yeah.
in the story.
The outline also touched upon the potential confusion of mapping out extended sequences across multiple cards, like a chase scene.
Right. A chase scene might involve several different locations, a series of rapid actions.
Yeah.
You might be tempted to dedicate a separate card to each stage of the chase.
Yeah, like a car chase going through 5 different streets.
Right. And you think, okay, I need 5 cards.
Yeah.
But on the board, a sequence like that is often just a single beat
Okay.
in the overall story.
So it's really just one card.
One continuous piece of action that serves to advance the plot
Yeah.
or escalate the conflict.
Okay.
So for your initial planning, you can just put it all on one card.
That really simplifies things.
It does.
So as our listener starts filling in the scenes between these major project milestones, how does the board help you identify weaknesses or gaps?
One of the best things about using the board
Yeah.
is how easily it lets you identify black holes in your story or your project plan.
Okay.
Those points where You struggle to see how one part connects to the next.
Right.
And on the board, these missing links become very obvious visually.
Yeah.
You'll see these big stretches of empty space.
Like literally a black hole.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they force you to confront those missing connections.
Okay. A visual representation of the stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
And the outline also mentioned this thing called a light act 3.
Oh, yeah.
As being a very common issue.
It's almost universal.
Yeah.
In the early planning stages, Act 3 often ends up with just a couple of cards.
Right.
Something like hero figures out what to do now, and then the ship.
Right.
And it's telling.
Yeah.
Because it shows how sometimes we focus so much on the climax that we don't really think about the steps to get there.
Yeah. Or the resolution.
Yeah, the resolution.
Yeah.
So
how do you, as a screenwriter, or how could our listener, as someone planning a complex project, flesh out that final act or the resolution phase?
Well, the key is to revisit your earlier acts.
Okay.
Especially Act 1.
Yeah.
What setups did you establish? Were there any promises made that haven't been fulfilled?
Okay.
What about secondary storylines or parallel efforts?
Right.
They need to be resolved as well.
Yeah.
You need to tie up those loose ends.
Yeah.
Think about any recurring themes or objectives.
Gotcha.
Act 3 is where those threads need to come together.
Yeah.
You might even need to bring back elements or characters that you introduced earlier to create a satisfying conclusion.
So the final act isn't just the big finish.
No.
It's also the integration and resolution of all the preceding elements.
It's where it all comes together.
So to further help visualize these different threads and how they interweave the outline, mention the technique of color coding the cards.
Oh, yeah. This is where those different colored pens come in handy.
Okay.
And yes, it does take a bit more time, but it can be so insightful.
Okay.
Assign different colors to different character storylines.
Okay.
Maybe green for one character, red for another.
Yeah.
Whatever works for you.
Yeah.
And when you place these color-coded cards on the board, you get this immediate visual understanding of how these elements are interwoven throughout the story.
Right.
You can easily spot if certain aspects are being neglected or are not being developed effectively.
It's like creating a visual map.
It is a visual map.
Of the narrative and its different components.
Yeah.
And all of this pre-writing work on the board is aimed at saving time and preventing major issues later, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's more frustrating than putting all this time and effort into writing a screenplay or executing a project, only to discover some fundamental flaw
Oh my God.
that requires massive revisions.
Yeah.
It's much easier to identify and address those potential problems early on by moving some cards around on a board before you get too deep into it and fall in love with your words.
So the general target is about 40 cards on the completed board.
Right, about 10 per act.
What happens if you end up with way more or way less?
Well, if you find yourself with way more than 40 cards, maybe 50 or more, it probably means you have scenes that can be combined.
Okay.
Or unnecessary beats that can be cut.
Right.
You really need to look at each card.
Yeah.
And ask yourself, does this really move the story forward?
Yeah.
Can I combine it with something else?
Okay.
If you have way fewer than 40 cards, you've probably got some gaps in your narrative or your plan.
Some more work to do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say we've got 40 cards arranged on the board.
Right.
What are the final crucial steps? Okay, so once your scene cards are in place, you need to add 2 symbols to the bottom of each one.
Okay.
And I like to use different colored pens for these.
Okay. What are the symbols?
Plus, minus.
Plus, minus. Okay.
And then greater than, less than.
Okay, so plus, minus, and greater than, less than.
Yeah.
What do these represent in the context of a scene card?
So the plus, minus represents the emotional shift that happens in that scene.
Okay.
Every scene is like a mini-movie.
Yeah.
With a beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah.
Something should happen that causes a change in the emotional tone.
Okay.
It could go from positive to negative or negative to positive.
So even the shortest scene should have some kind of emotional arc.
Yeah, it should.
Okay.
And if you can't find an emotional change, it could be a weak scene.
Okay.
Or you haven't really figured out its purpose in the story.
Okay.
And then the greater than, less than symbol denotes conflict.
Okay.
Every scene needs conflict.
Gotcha.
You need to define who is in opposition to whom.
Right.
What are their goals?
Okay.
What are their motivations?
Gotcha.
It's like 2 forces meeting with different agendas.
So that could be physical?
It could be physical, verbal, psychological, any form of opposition.
So each scene needs both an emotional shift and a conflict.
It does, if you want to keep the audience engaged.
Yeah, okay.
And if you can't find a conflict,
Yeah.
you need to figure out how to introduce one.
Okay.
Or maybe that scene just isn't necessary.
Okay.
Aim for one clear primary conflict per scene.
And once you've added these plus, minus, and greater than, less than symbols to each card, what does the finished board look like?
The ideal outcome is a board with about 9 cards per act.
Okay.
Maybe a few extra for those really important scenes, bringing the total to about 40.
Okay.
And each card has the location, the time of day, a brief description of the action, the emotional shift, and the conflict.
And now it's tempting to just want to keep perfecting the board.
Oh, yeah.
Before actually starting to write.
You could spend forever arranging and rearranging those cards.
Yeah. Is there a risk of getting too bogged down in the planning phase?
Definitely. You don't get any points for having the prettiest board.
Right.
The goal is to prepare for writing.
Yeah.
Not to use the board as a fancy way to procrastinate.
Right.
So start writing when you feel like you're not getting anything more out of the board.
It's like packing for a trip. You need the essentials, but you don't want to spend so much time packing that you never actually go.
Right.
So now that you're actually writing, is the board a rigid structure?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's a guide.
Okay.
Not a contract.
Right.
You need to be open to deviating from it.
Okay.
As you're writing, new ideas will come up.
Yeah.
Characters will change.
Yeah.
The story might take you in a different direction.
It's part of the process.
It is?
So even if you veer away from the board as you're writing, are there any core principles or elements that you should keep in mind?
Yeah, those foundational principles are really important.
Like?
Make sure your act breaks land around the right page numbers.
Okay.
Make sure your midpoint and all his lost moments have the intended emotional impact.
Gotcha.
And always make sure every scene has a clear conflict.
Okay.
Those are the structural anchors.
So it sounds like the board is this compass that you can always go back to.
Exactly.
If you feel lost or unsure.
It's always there for you.
And the ultimate goal is to actually finish the screenplay.
Yes. Write the thing.
Write the thing.
That's the goal.
And if you find yourself stuck,
the
outline also mentioned bringing in a script consultant.
Oh, yeah. Someone with a fresh perspective.
Like a secret weapon.
Absolutely.
An experienced set of eyes.
Someone like Mike Cheetah. To give you some guidance.
So the board is laid out. You've identified the emotional shifts and the conflicts in each scene.
Right.
You've basically done all the prep work.
You're ready to go.
You're ready to write.
Write the screenplay.
So just to quickly recap, the board is this hands-on visual tool.
Yeah.
Screenwriters use it to plan their stories using index cards on a physical board.
It might seem old school, but it works.
You divide the board into 4 rows.
The 4 acts.
Right, and the ends of those rows are the critical turning points.
Exactly.
You start by capturing your initial scene ideas.
These burning ideas.
Right, and then you focus on those major structural beats.
Midpoint all is lost break, break into 2, break into 3.
It helps you identify gaps in your story.
Yeah.
Make sure you give Act 3 enough attention.
Right.
Color coding can be great for visualizing.
Very helpful.
And then around 40 cards.
That's the magic number.
Then you add the plus minus for emotional change.
Yeah.
Greater than, less than for conflict.
So every scene.
And that gives you a really strong foundation.
You're ready to start writing.
And remember, the board's a guide, but be adaptable.
Don't be afraid to deviate.
If the story takes you in a new direction,
that's what makes it fun.
But always keep those key structural elements in mind.
Yes.
Always. So as you, our listener, are thinking about this concept of the board and how it brings structure and clarity, take a moment to think about how you might apply similar principles to challenges in your own life.
Okay.
Beyond screenwriting.
Yeah.
Could visualizing the key stages and potential conflicts of any endeavor give you that same sense of clarity and direction before you jump into it?
It's worth considering.
Could creating a personal board help you identify the emotional shifts and core tensions in your own endeavors?
I like that, a personal board.
Yeah.
Might have to try that.
Consider how the principles of structure and conflict, which are so central to storytelling, could offer some insights into your own problem solving.
That's fascinating.
I'm planning.
It really is.
It's all about bringing intentionality and organization,
everything you do,
to your creative endeavors, whatever they may be. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
This was fun.
We'll catch you next time.
See ya.